All right, I believe that we should be live. Thank you for joining us today. You may have seen that this was originally scheduled for an hour earlier. I got caught up at work, but thankfully Ask Truth was able to be flexible, and here we are now. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for jumping over to this stream. When I tried to open the other one just to get ready, not actually start it. I must have accidentally clicked the start button in the corner as I was opening the window or something because it just started. It's like, you're live. I'm like, what do you mean I'm live? I just opened the window. But anyway.
It actually offended me a little bit, Thaddeus, that you didn't address the audience and say hello. But I am proud of you for not saying anything inappropriate when you realized that you were live. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that you were making some sort of poetic live gesture about the substance of the Muslim argument for this particular topic today. So I thought, you know what, that might just be perfect enough and speak volumes enough for how strong the Muslim argument is for Deuteronomy 18:18. But as it turns out, you were it was just a mistake.
Yep, just some user error there. Mojo Dude previewing a upcoming week, not previous, upcoming week, says, Makmadim!
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Hopefully we find him because it's pretty embarrassing. I get really sad for the Muslims when they don't find him. So I'm actually genuinely hoping that we can find Muhammad somewhere in the scriptures. So at least we can be like, look, there he is. Stop bragging about it. But I don't know. We'll see. We have to be honest. We have to be honest.
Definitely. Maybe, I mean, we're going to give this a fair shake. We're going to look at the best Muslim arguments, and who knows, maybe we'll find Muhammad somewhere in there. Who knows, maybe it'll even be today. A couple of
Might
people are
be,
saying that
actually.
there's a lot of lag. So we're getting a well done and a woohoo. So I think that means everything's working now, that we're
All
in
right.
sync, and we definitely have video. So without further ado, maybe we can actually get started with the show. Again, thank you for sticking around while we figured this out. Yeah, dang technophobes. Yeah, that definitely seems to be the case today because just can't get anything right. And we do have confirmation that the video is in sync this time. So that seems to have cleared things up. So let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the technology that allows us to connect with people from around the world, even if we're not always perfect in using it. As we look at the Muslim claims of finding Muhammad in the Bible today, we ask that everyone look at the Bible and look to it for authority. Muslims have to look to it as an authority, or it makes no sense to find Muhammad into it. And of course, Christians will naturally recognize its authority. We pray that everyone listening carefully examine what the text actually says, that they carefully examine what we have to say, and they make up their own minds about what the truth is, not listening to, or not just taking in their preconceived notions about Muhammad being in the Bible or even Muhammad not being in the Bible, but look at what the text says and how that relates to the Muslim claims. Because after all, we should all want truth. And if Islam is the truth, I certainly would like to know that. And if Islam is not the truth, I would hope that Muslims would like to know that. So we just pray that you guide everyone watching to the truth today. We ask that you be with us and that you guide our discussion and that you prevent us from theological error. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Alrighty, any words of introduction from you, or should we dive in with our video?
Dive in, my friend. Let's get it going.
All right. When we left off, our protagonist Omar had just had, and lost, a battle with jihadis. His peaceful Islam proved no match for true Islam. As he awakens, he quickly finds his dreams of a better life are crushed. He slowly descends to find what remains of his Bible verses, the proof of Muhammad's prophethood he had been gathering. There's nothing there. He desperately scours the scene, hoping to find any hint that Islam is true. "Zara, where are you?" he cries. His wife has gone too, taken as a sex slave by the jihadis. All seems lost. What is a reasonable, moderate Muslim to do? Then, suddenly, he sees a ray of hope. What is that? Did a Bible verse survive the corruption? Taking a closer look, he sees Deuteronomy 18:18. "Don't worry, little verse. I'll make you about Muhammad whatever it takes. No amount of context or common sense could make me doubt you. I won't even be dissuaded if the surrounding verses directly condemn Muhammad." Despite his words, deep inside, Omar's confidence is low. He must now seek out Muslim apologists who will tell him the lies he wants to hear and make him believe his imaginary God just might be real after all. The way forward is clear, but the road is fraught with pitfalls. Perhaps he'll meet a Christian who properly exegetes the text. Or maybe he'll encounter the greatest danger Islam has ever faced, a fish thinking for himself. Will Omar's faith survive? Stay tuned to find out. All right. I think everything came through, but the studio did pop up with a warning. We've detected copyrighted material. We may have to block your stream. But of course, we are using the images, but providing our own narration, well in accordance with fair use. The clearest cases of fair use are commentary, which is not what we're doing, or parody, which is what we're doing. So it should definitely be within fair use. And I uploaded the clip to YouTube, and there was no complaint about it. So I think we're okay. But it did pop up with that warning. So that's where we're at.
Well, that'll get the adrenaline going. That'll get us prepared for the rest of the stream, man. Do you have anything you would like to add before we get started?
No, I think that covers it. We will open up the stream later for Muslim responses, so have your arguments ready.
All right, so I'm going to try to share my screen without any issues. So you should be seeing it now. Yes, Thaddeus?
Yes, and
all right.
Now everyone else can see it.
And I made it full screen. I'm going to hide this little box down here so it's not annoying the heck out of me. And we will get started. All right. So last week we talked about a lot of things. And audience, if you were here last week, I do want you to also be thinking about some of the things that we covered, the verse at hand that we are using, which is Quran chapter 7, verse 157. And I'm also going to ask Thaddeus to give us a little bit of a rundown, but I do want to hear from the audience as well, some of the takeaways from last week's conversation. And as you guys are writing in your responses, I'm going to have Thaddeus give us a little bit of a rundown on what conclusions and what topics we covered in our last episode, the introduction to why it's so important to find Muhammad in our scriptures.
Yes, absolutely. So we looked at chiefly Quran 7:157, which declares that the Jews and Christians will easily recognize Muhammad written in their own scriptures. And it gives this as a kind of warning to the Jews and Christians that, you recognize Muhammad as a prophet and you're not following him. So they have to be able to recognize him. They have to look to the scriptures that they had available If all is given this warning and the scriptures have already been corrupted, then he is pretty incompetent for making that declaration. If, on the other hand, it is in the scriptures, supposed to be in the scriptures they have, well, we know what those are because we have manuscripts from the 7th century and we have manuscripts from before that time, and they match what's in our modern Bible. So this means that Muslims have to find clear evidence that Jews and Christians would accept as a picture of Muhammad in the Bible. If they don't, that means that they're one of two things. Either their scripture is lying, or the author of their scripture was too incompetent to realize that what he was saying isn't true. Either way, that doesn't look like a God to me. So if Muslims want to stay Muslim, they have to find Muhammad in the Bible, which is, of course, why they make these attempts. We haven't looked at any specific arguments yet. We'll start doing that this week. And who knows? Maybe we'll say, yeah, that does actually kind of sound like Muhammad.
Mm-hmm.
There's one verse in mind that they quote that I think, kind of actually does sound like Muhammad. We'll get to that in a later week. But this week we'll be looking at Deuteronomy 18:18, which is probably the most popular place for Muslims to look. And to their credit, this passage at least is a prophecy about a coming prophet. Most of the things they point to have nothing to do with a claimed prophet. They're just passages that vaguely speak of Arabia, so they say they're about Muhammad, or they're passages that have a word that sounds like Muhammad, so they say that must be Muhammad, or they're passages that are clearly about something different. So that's kind of where we stand so far.
Yeah, that's good. I don't know if you got any audience participation in this just yet, but you did mention a couple of things that would be about the author of the Quran, right? Either he was ignorant and he didn't know that Muhammad was going to be in the scriptures, or he was too weak to maintain the scriptures that had descriptions about Muhammad. But the third one I think you missed, Thaddeus, I don't know if the audience caught it or not, was that Allah himself changed our scriptures so that Muslims and Christians and Jews could not find Muhammad in the scriptures. So we've got ignorant, we have impotent, and we have malicious as really the three options, right? So what happens if we do find Muhammad in the scriptures? Well, that's a great question. If we find Muhammad in the scriptures, what it ends up doing is affirming our scriptures as being true, and then on their face, our scriptures completely contradict in key theological ways the assertions of the Quran, right? So even if we find Muhammad, the Quran is wrong. If we don't find Muhammad, pretty obvious, the Quran is wrong. And then the likely conclusions that come from that are Allah is a false God, Muhammad's a false prophet, either because they are malicious, impotent, or ignorant. And in no way, shape, or form is there a winning solution for Muslims, especially when they start to use those fallback arguments. Before I move on, Thaddeus, did you select any?
Yeah, we got a couple comments from D here. Anthony Rogers just did a stream the other day about this passage, and Tovia Singer, who is, of course, every Muslim's favorite Jew, highly recommend that stream. I have not seen that, but Anthony always does great material, so I can recommend it without even seeing it.
I did actually watch it last night live, and I rewatched it today, and he did a fantastic job. So clearly, you and I are not as theologically sound as him. However, we do have a lot of the same points, and because we're doing a little bit more precise way, I think we're going to add a few more points as well. So anybody would be well to go watch that stream also. It was a fantastic stream. And he had technical difficulties too, by the way. He thought he had his microphone plugged in, but he didn't. So that was pretty funny.
Good to know it's not just us.
And not just us.
Yeah. Litigus says Muhammad should have just added verses to the Bible like Joseph Smith did, but he couldn't read or write. And I think if you look at the actual author of the Quran, I think they thought they were teaching the same message as what the Bible teaches. They affirm it over and over again. However, they didn't actually really know what was in the Bible. They only had vague ideas from hearing oral stories. And so they ended up completely contradicting it.
Yep, which leads one to wonder if the author of the Quran is really an all-knowing God, or if it was really an ignorant 7th century caravan trader who heard stories from people. One never really quite knows. Any more comments, Thaddeus, before we move on?
A couple more. Yep. Dee also pointed out that we said last week that this is an objective test, but it's not just, oh, I see Muhammad, from the Muslim perspective.
Right.
Because that can be said regardless. There has to be some actual evidence that a non-Muslim would accept.
Correct. Yep. So many people hold false beliefs. I remember I had a slide about that last week. So a lot of people do hold false beliefs, but just because I'm convinced of a false belief doesn't make it any more true than it factually is false. So this is one of those things that an unexamined belief is not worth having. So I have no doubt that Muslims are convicted and convinced that they have found Muhammad in our scriptures. But in order for them to maintain and strengthen their belief, it does need to be held up to questions and examination, like exactly what we're doing, so that they can justify and verify their beliefs, or that they can be justified in falsifying and disbelieving what it is that they believe, which requires humility. And this is one of the most key and one of the most important factors into this. If somebody's watching this, they need to be willing to lay aside their own presuppositions. They need to approach the subject with as unbiased a mind and a heart as possible in order to reach true factual conclusions, as opposed to just using their cognitive bias and ignoring things that don't make sense, and only listening to things that do make sense. So one of the quotes we also used from last week was, if the Bible is reliable enough to verify Muhammad as a prophet, then the Bible is also reliable enough to falsify Muhammad as a prophet. That's the little dilemma that Muslims find themselves in when they get into this finding Muhammad in the scriptures argument.
The Great Commission mentioned Isaiah 42. Don't worry, we'll get to that in a later week. Deuteronomy 18 is the classic most popular passage, but these days a lot of Muslims go to Isaiah 42. Definitely a close second, if not even the most popular nowadays. So we'll definitely do that one in a future week. But we're going to kind of take them in the order they're in the Bible. So we start with Deuteronomy.
Yep. So we are taking this systematically. Like he said, we're starting chronologically from the beginning of the Bible through the end of the Bible. So each and every single Muslim claim, whether it be from an ancient commenter on the scriptures, or whether it be pop level Muslim things, we're going to try to attack, and we're going to try to examine every single claim that Muslims make. So stay tuned for that.
Absolutely. So that's all the comments from the audience for now. Thank you for those. And
all right,
we can start on our look.
Okay, so spoiler alert. If you don't want to know how this is going to go, then don't pay attention to the next 30 to 60 seconds, right? So this is kind of the breakdown of how this is going to happen. So we discover almost immediately that Muhammad couldn't possibly be the prophet like Moses. After we immediately disqualify him, we will then continue to debunk that he could be the prophet from any possible conceivable way that the Muslims have forwarded. And in fact, we will prove that using the passage the Muslims have gone to, that the passage condemns Muhammad. And then finally, at the end of all of this, we will use the passage the Muslims have sent us to give them a real hope into a real prophet for real salvation. So let's go ahead and start with the general prophecy, or what they go to, Deuteronomy 18:18. It goes like this: I will raise up a prophet for them from among their countrymen like you, and I will place words into his mouth, and he shall speak to them everything that I have commanded them. Now, you will see that I highlighted countrymen. A lot of times this is also translated in different translations, brethren or brothers, right? So a key criteria that the Muslims are going to use is trying to prove and affirm that Muhammad is in the literal line of the Israelites, right? So they're going to say that Muhammad is a brother to the Israelites. We're going to dive really deeply into that, but I'm going to give you a brief synopsis of what they mean. Muslims believe that Muhammad is a descendant of Ishmael. Like I said, we're going to get deeper into whether or not he is. And they believe that because he is a descendant of Ishmael, that he can be qualified as a brother to the Israelites. So from the semantic word, from the Hebrew definition of the word that is used that I highlighted, which was countrymen or brethren, we can read 1 through E different understandings of what the word could possibly mean. So it could be 1A, brother of a separate parent, half brother, relative, kin, each to the other, which is like a reciprocal relationship, or figuratively in terms of resemblance. So those are the arguments that Muslims are going to be working with. So the question we're going to ask and the questions that we are going to answer is Muhammad a brethren to the Israelites or a countryman to the Israelites? So 1A, we're going to eat each one of these by itself. A brother of the same parents. Clearly, Muhammad is not a member of Israel or Jacob's immediate family. He is not a bloodline descendant from the Jewish tribe. He is neither a half brother. This is 1B. Muhammad is not a descendant from the brother or half brother of Israel or Jacob. Now we can start to get into some gray area discussions here. 1C, this is where Muslims need to go in order to make their argument that Muhammad could possibly be considered a brethren to the Israelites, a relative or a kinship or someone of the same tribe. So the question that we have to answer is Muhammad a descendant from any relative? Is he a kin or a tribe to Israel? Is Muhammad descended from a reciprocal relationship with Israel, or does Muhammad somehow resemble an Israelite in some way, form, or fashion, right? The last three you can make an argument for. The first two, clearly Muhammad is not either one of those things. So like I said, they're going to claim that Muhammad is an Ishmaelite. And they're going to claim that because he is an Ishmaelite, that puts him in the general category of being a relative to Jacob. Excuse me, sorry. So let's just start out with this little statement. Claims without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. A Muslim can come up to you and say, well, Muhammad was an Ishmaelite. And you go, okay, what is the evidence for Muhammad being a descendant of an Ishmaelite? They're going to give you some weak inferences, which we will get more into, especially in the Isaiah type of passages. They're going to give you in things like the Kadarites, and they're going to say, the Arabs and all those types of things, meaning that Muhammad comes from that general line. And then we'll discover here in a little bit how Muslim scholars have tried to trace the lineage from Muhammad back to Ishmael. And the best they can do is trace his lineage back to a person named Adnan, who, guess what, is not traceable to being an Ishmaelite, right? So they have a weak inference with their argument, which means they have weak evidence for their argument. And since they have basically no evidence for the argument, we can dismiss their argument full stop.
Before you go further, I want to make a comment there that actually that relation to Adnan is interesting, because this is a common pattern in the history of Islam, that the early Muslims don't seem to know much. And, they only can trace him back. I think it's like 6 generations or something, getting nowhere near the time they need to relate him to Isaac or Ishmael or anyone else. And then over time, suddenly more information comes to light that when Muslims centuries later are trying to prove their case, oh yeah, we know that Muhammad is related. So you can find a genealogy that supposedly ties him back to Ishmael, but that comes several centuries after the time of Muhammad. And
correct.
You have to ask, is this from people in a position to know? especially since earlier generations didn't know this information? Or is it more likely that someone just made this up?
Yeah, just making up a list of names. It actually kind of reminds me a little bit of the miracle claims of Muhammad, right? We all know that the Quran explicitly says that Muhammad came with no miracles. He will perform no miracles. But as we see later generations of Muslims with the Hadith collections 200 years later, 1,000 kilometers away, they start to come up with all of these incredible miracles that Muhammad supposedly did. It's pretty similar in the fact that it's like, why did early Muslims not say no, he's clearly an Ishmaelite, or why did early Muslims not immediately claim that they witnessed miracles? And even still, why did the Quran say that Muhammad would come with no miracles when Muslims 200 years later would basically live and die by the fact that Muhammad performed miracles? It makes exactly no sense to me. All right. So assuming assumptions are absolutely accurate, and this is what we're going to have to do for the rest of today, we will test the passage and see if it might still fit Muhammad, assuming he is, in fact, a relative in the general sense that he could potentially, maybe, almost be a brethren to the Israelites. Again, we're going to read the passage, Deuteronomy 18:18. It says, and I highlighted the important speaker here, I will raise up a prophet for them from among their countrymen like you, and I will place my words into his mouth, and he shall speak to them everything that I have commanded him. Audience question time, Thaddeus question time. When he says when the speaker of this verse in Deuteronomy 18:18 says who is the speaker? If you want to pull up something from the audience here, Thaddeus, please go ahead. Or if you might potentially know who I is, I'd like to hear from you as well.
Well, of course, they're a little bit behind us, 15, 20 seconds behind us.
I tried to talk long enough to get us to that, but yeah.
So I'll just go ahead and then, of course, it'd take time to type it in as well. I'm sure most of the audience have the answer on the tip of their tongues, and they're just trying to type it in real fast. But I'll go ahead and answer for them. This would be God, who the text identifies as Yahweh. You already said that we had to give the Muslims one assumption. I think maybe we should keep track of how many assumptions we have to give them to keep this this going. There you go. Leviticus says I is God.
God, yes.
And
but
Villainous,
specifically, right, because, go ahead, sorry.
And Villainous said the big boy, which I'm going to say is presumably also referring to God. But yes, the text explicitly identifies who God is. He has a name, and that name is Yahweh.
Right. So when you go back to the Hebrew text, you will see the tetragrammaton as who is being the speaker, who is the I. When you read this into context, if I use especially for the Old Testament, I'll use the LEB Bible because it just says Yahweh wherever it says Yahweh. I know for some people it's, they don't want to say the name of God, but the LEB Bible makes it very clear. So if you do want an English translation, and I'm sure there are others out there that actually just say when the Hebrew says Yahweh, it just says Yahweh, so that we're not confused about it, right? Because sometimes when you just read Lord in all caps, right, that's when they're using the divine name. But it just makes it easier when you read the LEB, right? So, yes.
Before you go on, I did want to give credit here. Mojo Dude said the answer is the covenant name of the God of Abraham. See, he typed all those words, so he was slower in giving the response. But I think that the cookie still goes to him for the best answer.
All right. Congratulations. You get a cookie. Right. So you guys got it right. Thaddeus, you got it right. And clearly when you read the context, especially with the Hebrew, the I speaking in this passage is Yahweh. So this leads us to a question. If this is possibly about Muhammad, the question we ask is, did Muhammad speak and deliver revelations in God's covenant name, Yahweh? Thaddeus, did he?
He did not.
Okay. So immediately that disqualifies him. immediately. That is disqualifying to Muhammad because he did not deliver a revelation in the name of Yahweh. Plain and simple. If you're having a discussion with a Muslim, this is one particular way you can debunk their argument. Immediately disqualifies him. Okay. Now, even if the assumed assumptions are absolutely accurate, like I said, Muhammad is disqualified. So even if he was an Ishmaelite, still, he didn't speak a name, or he did not deliver a revelation in the name of Yahweh. That's pretty simple. What kind of response when we bring this up do we get from Muslims, Thaddeus? I'm kind of showing it here on the screen, but what do you typically hear if it's not just what's here on the screen?
Well,
when
you
we say that to them?
You shouldn't have put the screen up because I was going to say that exact thing. They'll
It's
say,
gone.
they'll say, well, Jesus didn't speak the name Yahweh, therefore none of the prophets did, therefore Muhammad's still a prophet. Something along those lines.
Right. Exactly, right. So that's just known as the tu quoque fallacy. It says, like, basically, well, we have the problem, we admit it, we're wrong, but so do you, so don't bring it up to us, right? And that's the essential Muslim way of going around particular subjects. If you ever get a Muslim cornered, or they get into a position where they're not quite sure of the answer, instead of them saying, I don't know the answer, they immediately flip it. The Bible is corrupted. The Trinity makes no sense. How can God die? Those types of questions are what we get from Muslims. They just flip it right around and they say, you too have the same problem. These are red herrings. These are straw men. And these are tu quoque fallacies, which we've talked about in some previous streams here. So exactly like what you said, show me where Jesus speaks or delivers a revelation in the name of Yahweh. Now, even if Jesus never delivered a message in the name of Yahweh, and it proves that Jesus was not a prophet, that disproves Islam, because Islam believes that Jesus was the Messiah of Yahweh and was a prophet. That disqualifies, just because Jesus has been disqualified and therefore disqualified them, it also just disqualifies Muhammad on his face as well. So we could both have the same problem and we could both be wrong. Right. But the burden of proof is not on us. We do not need to answer these types of objections. But because we're Christians, we turn the other cheek, we go the extra mile. We will go ahead and answer the question on whether or not Jesus gave revelation in the name of Yahweh. First and foremost, pretty simple. Jesus' name, Yeshua in the Hebrew, is Yahweh is salvation. That's what it means. The name of God is actually Yahweh within Jesus' own name. So first and foremost, clearly he came in the name of Yahweh, since he is named Yahweh is salvation. But we can take it a step further. We can read the scriptures in which Jesus is speaking. We're going to go specifically to the scene where the Holy Spirit leads Jesus into the desert, right, to have him fast for 40 days and 40 nights and have the devil attempt to tempt him. These are some of the responses that Jesus gives to Satan. He makes reference to previous scriptures. So this is what it says in the New Testament here on the left. No, says Jesus, the scriptures say, people do not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Right? So the New Testament is written in what language, Thaddeus?
Greek.
Okay. So I wouldn't expect to see a Hebrew word here. But what Jesus is quoting is he's quoting a passage from Deuteronomy, and we can see specifically what he was quoting. Deuteronomy, I think this is 6 or 8. I'm sorry, I didn't put it on my note. And basically, I'll just read the end of it, is, you know that not by bread alone, but by all that goes out of the mouth of Yahweh. Again, using the LEB Bible. He uses the word Yahweh. Man does not live by bread alone, but from the words that come out of the mouth of God, or the mouth of Yahweh. So Jesus is using scripture that pronounces Yahweh. We see the same thing with the second temptation. The scriptures also say, you must not test the Lord your God. Here he's quoting again from Deuteronomy. You shall not put Yahweh your God to the test as you tested him at Manasseh. Pop quiz, Thaddeus. See if you can do this.
Uh-oh.
So in the Greek, we see Lord in all caps. Do you know what the Greek word is that Christians oftentimes capitalize as Lord?
Um, not a,
And
I
I'm putting
think
you
I
on the
do, but
spot,
it's not
buddy.
coming to the tip of my tongue here. So,
So it's curios, and I may be misreading, but it's curios, right? So what do we see here? You shall not put Yahweh, our God, or your God, to the test. What we see in the Greek is you must not test the Lord your God. Okay, so the word Lord is actually Yahweh. So in the Greek, kurios. So when we see kurios written in the Greek or Lord written in the Greek, specifically as it makes a divine claim, we can actually start to extrapolate that the Greek writers of the New Testament, when they use that phrase, are actually referring back to the tetragrammaton or the word Lord or Yahweh from the Hebrew scriptures. So we see in two examples so far that Jesus is using the divine name when he is responding to Satan. Jesus then finally, after the third temptation, says, "Get out of here, Satan, for the scriptures say you must worship the Lord," again, all caps. You'll see this over in the Greek, or sorry, in the Hebrew, "your God, and serve him only." Again, this is from Deuteronomy. "You shall fear Yahweh your God," or in Greek, "Kurios," your I don't know exactly what they use for God, theon, um, "and you shall serve him, and by his name you shall swear." Again, Jesus is using previous Hebrew scriptures, right, to defend himself against the devil's temptations. He is using the tetragrammaton. He is using the divine name of God, and he himself, within his name, uses the divine name of God. So that's a little sideways track, but I want to walk that extra mile with Muslims so that when they bring up this tu quoque fallacy, we can actually defeat it on its face. So, anything you'd like to add to this, Thaddeus, before I move on?
I think that this comment here will go well with your next slide. D said he's not a big fan of the argument as it was originally stated. Quote, "Not using the covenant name, even if Kyrios is a substitute, it does not match the wording of the original argument of the name." So I would tend to agree. This isn't definitive.
Hmm.
Like you can speak. So a prophet is someone who speaks for God, right? So you can speak for God without using his name necessarily, his divine name. Especially since by the time of Jesus, it was custom not to ever speak the divine name. Of course, we should see some sort of connection between the God of Islam and the God of the Bible, if it's supposedly the same being. We should see some recognition that he is speaking in that God's name.
Hmm.
The kind of thing that we just saw with Jesus, where, he quotes the scriptures that use the divine name. Or he
Correct.
refers to the attributes of Yahweh. And, Muhammad, of course, or the Quran, I should say, refers to some divine attributes, but they're the kind of
Hmm.
generic attributes that you could use for just about any deity. They're not the kind of attributes that are specific to the way Yahweh describes himself.
Correct. Right. And even in the fact and in the case, and we talked about this a lot last week, that how overlapped the New Testament is and how many quotations it uses directly from the Old Testament. Whereas when you compare that overlap with the New Testament and the Old Testament to the Quran, which is supposedly a continuation of both of those books that's their supposed God also authored, we don't see these overlapping verses. We don't see direct quotations. In fact, we only see one quotation directly taken from the Bible, which is "eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth" verse, and literally nothing else do we see. So the author of the Quran clearly has no idea what was actually written within the scriptures themselves. Anything else before I go on, Thaddeus?
No, that's good. I was just going to say that,
Perfect.
we can go ahead and grant this assumption. This third assumption here that Allah is the Arabic way of referring to Yahweh.
Mhm.
And you got that on your
Um,
slide here. We got to ignore the lineage of Muhammad, and then we got to
mhm.
ignore the Yahweh debacle. So we're granting a second assumption here, and we're
Yep.
ignoring that they didn't defend themselves, and we had to do the defense for them. Because, D here provided a adequate defense, but the Muslim apologist isn't going to say something like that. They're going to go straight to, well, that's not the way Jesus spoke, because they don't seem to know how to. I find often that the best responses to my videos come from Christians who are like,
Yes.
here's a weakness in your argument. And
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is that they're not beholden to think that Muhammad's infallible. They're not beholden to think that the Quran is the word of God. So they can offer defenses that the Muslim might not want to go to because they imply weakness, even if they're a better defense than nothing, which is what the Muslim offers us. And then, of course, the other reason is that the Muslims are often, the average Muslim, a common Muslim, is not encouraged to think for themselves. So they don't have a habit of thinking about these things deeply. They have a habit of memorizing arguments and repeating it. Copying the Zakir Naik example. I don't think anyone would say that Zakir Naik is an excellent thinker or thinks well on his feet. But he's very good at memorizing things and regurgitating them. And that's what the average Muslim has come to expect from a authority figure.
Correct. Now, moving on, I'm going to back us up here a little bit back to the verse. All right. So one of the things that Yahweh is going to do is he's going to place words into this prophet's mouth, and he shall speak to them everything that I command him. So the question is that we're going to have to ask is, did Muhammad speak only in everything that he was commanded to speak? Now, Thaddeus, I know we talked a little bit about you taking over this particular thing. If you're prepared to do so, go ahead. If not, I can go ahead and tackle it. But briefly, there are numerous, I think upwards of 50 different independent sources from Muslims themselves that say that Muhammad did in fact accidentally reveal words from Satan as if they were the Quran, right? If this is true, that is very problematic because that means that he did not speak the words of even his Allah, God, let alone the words of Yahweh. He also denied his Allah-given desire, right, for his adopted son's wife, whom he saw scantily clothed and had his heart leap for, named Zainab. He denied that he wanted to marry her. He told his adopted son that he did not want him to divorce her, and yet that goes against what Allah commanded him to do. Allah said, no, you're wrong. You need to marry her. And the same type of thing happened when he was caught sleeping with one of his slave girls, and he swore to his wives that he wasn't going to do it again. And Allah once again said, oh, by the way, you need to do that because I want you to do that. But go ahead, Thaddeus, and expand upon these different things if you would like.
Yeah. So I guess we'll just kind of take them in order here, starting with the satanic verses. This is probably the most popular Christian response, saying that if you just read a couple verses further in Deuteronomy, chapter 18, it says, anyone who speaks in the name of another God or falsely speaks in my name, something I did not tell him to say, is a false prophet and should be stoned to death. Mm-hmm. So most of the audience is probably fairly familiar with the basic story here, but we'll go ahead and give a brief outline anyway. So Muhammad wasn't doing so well early in his career. He wasn't convincing very many people to start following him, and in particular his own tribe, his closest relatives, he was not really reaching. So he longed for this revelation that would fix that problem. He longed for a revelation that would give something to his tribes people to make it easier for them to convert to Islam. And lo and behold, he got that revelation. A common pattern that he got revelations that fulfilled his desires, in this case not a particular selfish one. He got a revelation that said that Alat, Aluza, and Manat, three pagan three of the most popular pagan goddesses, were exalted cranes that would carry your prayers to Allah, basically saying that they were valid to pray to. Or, in other words, that Islam is at least partially polytheistic. There might be one supreme God, but there are other gods that are valid to pray to. The crowd was overjoyed. They bowed down in honor of this revelation, like, finally, something we can agree with. And his closest followers, those who had also already converted to Islam, they also bowed down. And Muhammad himself bowed down in honor of this revelation.
Whoops.
Then a couple years later, this is the part that is not often emphasized, but it wasn't like the next day. It was a couple years later, he realized that, oops, this revelation wasn't really from Allah. This revelation had come from, according to Muhammad, Satan. Satan had tricked him into giving this revelation. And his defense was, he was worried about this, and surprise, surprise, Gabriel came to him, or I should say Jibreel came to him and said, don't worry, this happens to all the prophets. There isn't any prophet who wasn't tricked by Satan. Now, the Muslim can't attempt a tu quoque fallacy here because there is no record of any other prophet at any point being tricked by Satan. So, big problem there. He not only said there was three other gods that were worthy of worship, he was tricked by the devil. In my opinion, pretty clear indication that he was not under any kind of divine protection. And he gave these words as if they were part of the Quran, as if they were Allah's speech. In other words, if we're granting the assumption that Allah is the same God as in the Bible, he gave a revelation in the name of Allah that was not from God. And guess what? According to the very passage the Muslim has brought us to, that disqualifies him. Anyone who speaks in the name of another God or speaks words that are untrue, that didn't come from me, he's a false prophet.
Exactly. Now I'm gonna have you pause right there just for a second, Thaddeus, because when we originally started this series, I said there are a few falsifiable claims that we can test, and one of them was the claim to produce a surah like it, right? But one of the problems with that particular claim was it is a little bit of a subjective criteria. I could produce a surah in Arabic that I believe is beautiful, but a Muslim is going to hear it and go, no, that's not as beautiful as the Quran. You have failed to produce a surah like it, because there's really no actual criteria for that particular verse. However, this does, if the satanic verses are true, which many sources would make us believe that it was, and it meets the criteria of embarrassment, if that's true, somebody did actually meet the surah like it, because the best understander and the best interpreter for the Quran is who, Thaddeus?
Muhammad.
And Muhammad received a revelation from Satan, correct, according to these stories. And since he received a revelation from Satan and he didn't recognize it as any different than Allah, because he went on preaching this for years and he didn't realize it until Jibril comes to him and says, oh, by the way, this thing that you keep repeating, you got that from Satan. So to me, it seems pretty obvious within the Muslim view and paradigm that Satan himself actually met the criteria to be to create a surah like a surah in the Quran, because in fact, he did create a surah in the Quran until it was abrogated and taken out. So sorry, Muslims, that is a major issue for you as well.
Yeah, I mean, it has multiple problems with that, but in particular for today's purpose, he's speaking words, he's saying these words in the name of Allah, and they're not coming from Allah, which means if Allah is the author of Deuteronomy 18:18, then Muhammad's in big trouble.
Yep.
He has failed the test. Let's put it that way.
All right. Well, thank you for that, sir. So we must continue to ignore these things. We must continue to ignore Muhammad's lineage issue, the Yahweh debacle. We must ignore their two quoque fallacies. And we must ignore the fact that Muhammad didn't actually fulfill what this verse says, which is speak what Yahweh has told him to say. So we're going to just continue to ignore all of these things. And we're going to do probably the most rational thing, which is to read the verse itself in context. On your screen, I've highlighted a few key points that we will be going through so that you guys can understand it. Now, Yahweh, it says, Yahweh your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your countrymen. And I'm going to zoom in on my own thing here because I got my camera in the way. So Yahweh your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your countrymen, and to him you shall listen. This is according to all that you ask from Yahweh your God at Oreb on the day of the assembly, saying, I do not want again to hear the voice of Yahweh my God, and I do not want to see again this great fire, so that I may not die. And Yahweh said to me, they are right in what they have said. I will raise up a prophet for them from among their countrymen like you, and I will place my words into his mouth, and he shall speak to them everything that I have commanded him. And then that man that will not listen to my words that he shall speak in my name, I will hold accountable. However, the prophet that behaves presumptuously by speaking a word in my name that I have not commanded him to speak, and who speaks in the name of other gods, then that prophet, thank you, Thaddeus, for spoiling it for us, shall die. And no, it's all good, brother. And if you say to yourself, how can we know the word of Yahweh has not been spoken to him? Whenever that prophet spoke in the name of Yahweh and the thing does not take place and does not come about, that is the thing that Yahweh has not spoken to him. Presumptuously the prophet spoke, and you shall not fear that prophet. So reading this in context, right, because they isolate it just to 1818. However, last week we talked about how Maududi said that we need to be reading it from verse 15, which is good. That's kind of where the context starts, through 19. He, for whatever reason, that is, we talked about this a little bit. Why do you think he cut it off at 19 and didn't keep on reading through, 20? Why do you think he did that?
Well, I don't think he could have read the passage and thought that that was the end of the thought, because it continues on with and. So I don't think that he could have done it for that reason. I think he must have done it for a different reason. Perhaps because he didn't want to believe what verse 19 and following had to say.
It's difficult, isn't it? So, however, the prophet that behaves presumptuously, right? So Muhammad, we can demonstrate, behaved presumptuously by speaking a word not in my name that I did not command him to speak in the name of other gods. What should happen to him again, Thaddeus?
If someone does that? Die.
And if he gives a prophecy, but the prophecy doesn't come to pass, should you fear that prophet?
No, because
these are some testable.
Yeah, I was going to say, he's not speaking on God's authority, so therefore the wrath of God is not on you for not following him.
Yeah. Thaddeus, you want to read this for us here? And then I know it's a little bit complicated, but I'm going to have you read it, and we're going to have you do a little bit of an exegesis for us.
All right. The speaker is Allah. Never mind. The speaker is Yahweh.
Right. So we're exegeting the passage. This is who is speaking.
Yes. The listener is the Ishmaelites. No, it's the Israelites. Sorry, I misread that. Specifically, the Israelites who experienced the Exodus among or in your midst. The prophets will speak all that Yahweh commands them. The prophet will not speak in the name anyone besides. We don't even have to cross out Allah here. I mean, Muhammad spoke in the name besides Allah.
Right.
And if a prophet speaks in the name of anyone besides Allah, no, Yahweh, they shall die.
All right. So that is the exegesis, right? So this is the proper exegesis. I know I put in those little cross mark things as a little bit of a joke, and the reason why I put them in there is because that is how a Muslim would actually have to read the passage, right? That's called eisegesis. They're reading in their assumptions and presuppositions into the text to try to force Muhammad into this particular scripture. I put the cross marks on there because this is what the scripture is actually saying, and it disqualifies Muhammad as being a prophet like Moses from the word go. All right. So using that proper exegesis, we can jump into the final thing that we have yet to disprove, which is to speak a false prophecy. So let's just say that Muhammad spoke 99 true prophecies. Let's say he gave 99 prophecies that came to pass, right? Muslims are going to be hard pressed, and they got to do quite a bit of backbending to really even prove one. But that's not even the criteria. The bar is set in this passage. If that prophet speaks in my name and the prophecy does not come to pass, you shall not fear that prophet. So here in Sahih Muslim, so if you're a Sunni Muslim, Sahih Muslim's as good as it gets. Book 41, number 750. Aisha reported that when the desert Arabs came to Allah's messenger, they asked about the last hour, as to when that would come. And he looked toward the youngest amongst them, and he said, if he lives, he would not grow very old, that he would find your last hour coming to you, and he would see you dying. What does that mean, Thaddeus?
Well, we'll say what it properly means first, and then we'll address the Muslim excuse after that.
Okay.
But properly, what it's saying is Muhammad's saying, I don't know how long this boy is going to live, but the end of the world's coming within his lifetime and within his youth even. Even if we, very old, that's subjective. Let's just ignore that part entirely and just say it has to be sometime in his lifetime. And let's say that this boy was 1 year old and he lived to be 120, tied the record for longest lived. That's the end of the world in the next 119 years. It's a bit more than 119 years since Muhammad gave this prophecy.
That's a bit of an issue, isn't it? Right. So if the last day did not come within that boy's lifetime, or even, let's grant a couple hundred years, or unless, Thaddeus, maybe this dude's still alive. You ever think about that? Because the Muslims do believe in the seven sleepers, and they can fall asleep for hundreds of years before they are awakened. Maybe that is one particular excuse they can come up with. But if this boy is not still alive to this day, or if somehow the last hour came and we're all here some other way, form, or fashion, then this prophecy did not come to pass. Now, did you want to give us a different explanation?
Yeah, I was going to say that would actually be a better defense. I've not heard a Muslim offer that. Again, Christians come up with better arguments for Muslims than they offer for themselves. That was on the fly,
brother. I just came over that right now.
But yeah, maybe miraculously this boy is not very old yet, and that he's growing very slowly, and he's only the equivalent of 10 years old or something. But ignoring that miraculous possibility, what Muslims usually say is, well, the boy died in his youth, therefore he didn't live, therefore you can't go to the second part of that verse.
I see what they did there. All right.
Playing some word games, basically, because that's clearly not what the verse is phrased in such a way that it doesn't matter if he lives or not. And then they try to say, well, he died, so it doesn't count.
Right. If he lived. Yeah, exactly. So regardless of how you do it, if the boy lives this long, a normal lifetime, the end would be there. And if he dies young, well, we would just assume that it would be until the end of his life when the last hour would come. That's a really bad argument. I actually like my argument better. Muslims, if you're trying to make an argument for this passage, consider what I just said. You might be able to, it's so unfalsifiable that, you can go ahead and believe your nonsense. We won't, but at least you can talk amongst yourselves.
I mean, there's plenty of Muslims that will tell you that the wall of Dhul Qarnayn is just some undiscovered place on the earth, and it's really holding back people that have been living there for thousands of years because as Allah has miraculously sustained these people. Because, oh, wait, that was another prophecy about the end times, wasn't it? Wow, what a
It
coincidence
should have
there.
happened by
Almost like
now.
Muhammad actually expected the end times soon.
Yep, yep, yep. We could probably do a whole stream on the different end time prophecies that apparently happened by the time of that young boy's lifetime. That he's still alive, but he's asleep. But anyway, moving on. Let's ignore some more facts, right? I keep coming back to this, right? Because I want to reiterate how many facts the Muslims do actually have to ignore in order to convince themselves, at least I doubt they're convincing anybody else, but convince themselves that Muhammad is a prophet. So we've got to ignore the fact of the lineage of Muhammad, the Yahweh debacle, the tu quoque fallacies, the presumptuous statements of Muhammad, the failed prophecies of Muhammad, and the fact that the Ishmaelites were not amongst or within the midst of the hearers at Horeb. So we're going to go back to the brethren statement, because I really do believe this is about the strongest argument that they can make. Is Muhammad a brother? And then if he is, then we can ignore all the rest of the stuff that we said we had to ignore, and we can make an argument that it is potentially, right? Because at the beginning I gave the A, B, C, D, E different ways of understanding it. And since Ishmael, although we can't officially link Muhammad to Ishmael, we'll assume assumptions. It is a brother to the Ishmaelites or some relative or to the Israelites. But anyway, so with all that said, let's go into the Hebrew. I don't speak Hebrew. I'm going to mispronounce this, but echem, right? Echem or something like that is how this is written, as you can see on your screen on the left-hand side. That is the Hebrew word for it, right? We're looking for a prophecy from Muhammad in the books of the Torah. Sorry, not from Muhammad. Please God forgive me, from Moses within the first 5 books of the Torah. This word in the exact form that it is used in Deuteronomy 18:18 is used one other time, and that is used in Genesis 48:6. This is the scene where Jacob, Israel, is blessing Joseph's boys, 2 boys, and he says by the names of their brothers in inheritance, right? So what we're talking about is descendant brothers, bloodline brothers, descended specifically from and through Jacob, who is known as Israel. So in this exact format, and the other way that it's used, it is used explicitly to refer to 1A, which is the brothers or a bloodline descendant of Jacob. So let's play a game of semantics, right? So brother by Israel or Jacob's bloodline only. So if Muslims want to make this work, one way that they can do it is to say that, well, Muhammad is a Jew. So if Muslims want to say that Muhammad is a Jew, then their argument can stick. They can say that he delivered messages and blah, 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 and we'll have to ignore all the facts that he was just a false Jewish prophet. But regardless, if Muslims want to maintain this within the semantic usage of the word for brothers and how Moses applied it, then they can conclude and make an argument that he is a prophet like Moses and he is Jewish, and therefore you can't come up with any objections against us. Thaddeus, do you think that any Muslims are going to be willing to utilize that?
I don't think
idea?
any Muslim's going to offer that argument. The irony here is that there would be Christians who would make that argument that Muhammad was actually a failed Jewish prophet.
Yeah, I know a lot of the sin sifters, I believe is what they're called. A lot of those folks have some different understandings of who Muhammad was, and you know what they're doing? They're making a stronger case for Muhammad being a prophet like Moses. But anyhow, let's move on. But maybe, right? And I'm putting a stretch out here, Thaddeus. Maybe Muhammad is an Edomite. It's possible, right? Because the word for brethren, although it's not in the exact format, God does say that the Edomites are the brothers of Israel. But let me ask you this. Why would he say that the Edomites are brothers of Israel, Thaddeus?
I'm not quite sure where you're going.
Okay, all right. So the Edomites are descendants of who?
Edom?
Edom or Esau, right? So Esau is the father of the Edomites.
Okay,
Who is
I get where you're
Esau the
going
twin
now.
brother of? You see
So,
where I'm going with it now?
yeah, you're saying that they won't want to make this argument since, of course, Esau is cursed.
Well, they can make that argument. I'm trying to help them out in any way, shape, or form. So my point being is you should not abhor. So basically, they're saying don't abhor your brothers, the Edomites, because I'm trying to make the argument for the Muslims that if Muhammad is an Edomite, then perhaps, right, because Jacob, right, was renamed Israel and all his descendants are known as Israelites, and Esau has a nation named after him, which are all his descendants are the Edomites, then what we can start to conclude here is that it's okay to call the Edomites brothers because literally they're brothers of Jacob. They're brothers of each other. They're twin brothers with the same father and the same mother, and therefore they do have a similar bloodline. So if Muhammad wants to, or Muslims want to make an argument that Muhammad is an Edomite, which again, the sin sifters can actually start to make this argument, then maybe he is. Do you think they're going to want to be that, though? You kind of already hinted at it, that they
Yeah,
probably don't want to be Edomites either.
yeah, I don't. You know, it's better than nothing, right? Which is what they have now. But I have a feeling it's not going to satisfy them because they
Right.
want their prophet to be perfectly connected with no
Yeah.
hint of contamination, and this is not going to be the right bloodline for that.
Exactly. No, for sure. Right. So let's try to figure this out, right? So if the Edomites, right, because they're related to Israel, if they're called brothers, then perhaps Ishmael, the Ishmaelites might be considered brothers of Jacob as well. But the issue is, if we're speaking strictly from family lineage, Ishmael, who's the brother of Isaac, right, and Isaac is the father of Jacob, that makes Ishmael an uncle to Jacob, right? Not a brother, but an uncle. Let's see if the Bible, throughout the entire scripture, Old Testament, New Testament, heck, we'll go to Apocrypha, I don't care, are the Ishmaelites referred to as brothers? The answer is no. They are referred to as brothers exactly 0 times. So even from the semantic level of this, it makes anyone besides an Israelite or perhaps an Edomite impossible to be a prophet like Moses, because from amongst their midst, the people who survived the Exodus, amongst their midst are the one who the prophet has to come from. And Muhammad, according to the traditions of Muhammad's, of the Muslims, which they can't even verify anyway, was an Ishmaelite. It's just all kinds of levels of impossible. So let's continue to ignore the facts. So although Muhammad has been disqualified several times over, Muslim propagandists will still make claims, right, Thaddeus? They're still going to keep going. This isn't
Well, of
enough for
course,
them.
as we covered last week, they don't have a choice. They have to make these claims because their religion is dependent on them. They can't
Right.
just pretend that they can't just state the obvious fact, I should say, that Muhammad's not in the Bible because their God claims he is. So they got to come up with something.
Right. So, but an honest and humble person watching this or listening to this or taking this information in, they have to start to come up with some serious questions on how it would be possible for Muhammad to be a prophet like Moses. Right? We've got one argument, right? Most Muslims never take you down that path if you're starting a discussion with them. What they start to try to do is just to bring up comparisons, right? Moses did this, Muhammad did the same thing, Moses did that, Muhammad did the same thing, and they don't take into consideration the context of the verse, what the verse is actually saying, what it requires, what a prophet like Moses is required to be. They just go straight to the most superficial levels possible. So although we could rightfully ignore that, we're going to be fair. We're going to be more than fair. We're going to hear them out. I found this on a Muslim website. I believe the Muslim website was JesusIsMuslim.com. So here's the points of comparison, right? You can tell what's happening here because Moses is in blue and Muhammad is in blue. And because they're both in the same color category, it means that they're the same. Okay, we're going to talk about Jesus here in a little bit, but we're going to ignore that bit of it, and we're going to do points of comparison between Moses and Muhammad. Moses and Muhammad were both born naturally. They were both political leaders. Both of them, nobody considered them to be God. They came with a new law. They both died naturally. They were both married, and they both fought their enemies. So the only conclusion that we can come up with, given the three choices on the board, really two, because Moses is Moses, the two choices is we know for sure that it's Muhammad and couldn't possibly be Jesus. But there's a problem with this, isn't there, Thaddeus?
Only one?
Say what?
I said only one?
Only one problem? Well, let's talk about the false dichotomy first. What's the issue with that?
Yeah, well, of course, I was joking. All of the problems would be related to this. That they've set it up that there's only two possibilities. Either it refers to Jesus or it refers to Muhammad. Of course, the vast majority of the world's population wouldn't agree with either of those, actually. Jews would say that it is not about Jesus, for sure. They certainly would say it's not about Muhammad. Atheists would say it's not about anything, and that you're just imagining stuff. Buddhists wouldn't have an opinion, but they probably would not say that it's a valid prophecy. Same with Hindus. They don't have any opinion who it might be, but they'd say it probably isn't a prophecy of the future since your religion's not true. And then, of course, even if even if those are two claims that are made, they both could be wrong. And the criteria they gave us were so arbitrary that just about every person who ever existed fulfilled those. Basically what they did is say, here's the things that are very unique to Jesus. Moses didn't have those same attributes, therefore Muhammad's a prophet.
Correct, right? So you just nailed it on the head, right? They invented this criteria. This criteria is not from the verse itself. This criteria is not unique, right? So if it was a true dichotomy, what they would do is it would narrow it down to those two individuals themselves would be the only two possible people that might be able to fulfill this role. But that's not true, because if we just use that criteria that they used on this website, what do we come up with? Well, we come up with something pretty extraordinary. And we're going to go ahead and walk the extra mile with the Muslims, because I'm going to make an argument, Muslims, that Napoleon Bonaparte is actually the same category as Muhammad is as a prophet like Moses, according to their criteria. So if we can get Napoleon Bonaparte to be the prophet like Moses within their own criteria, I'm pretty sure that we don't want Muslims, or we can't take that as a meaningful criteria, right? Because Napoleon, Thaddeus, was born naturally. He was considered human. He was a political leader. He was married. He fought his enemies, and he brought new laws. So given that state of criteria, Napoleon is as much fit to be a prophet like Moses as Muhammad. So clearly, this is the criteria used here, at least with this website, is completely meaningless, right? And I could probably come up with a dozen other people who did the same things, namely Joseph Smith, right, the founder of Mormonism. He would fit this category as well. And Joseph Smith might fit the category better because not only was he married to one person, he was married to multiple people, and he also received a revelation from an angel that told him things that don't align with the Bible at all. But at least Joseph Smith did better than Muhammad, because Mormons actually hold the Old Testament and the New Testament to some degree of authority. They just have added their third testament, which is like the Book of Mormon. So I would go so far as to say, if we're using this criteria and I had to pick a quote unquote prophet to follow, I'd go with Joseph Smith, and I would not go with Muhammad. I don't know about you, Thaddeus.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to agree. I would say that the criteria that Muslim randomly pulled out, basically they pulled them out because they were things that a couple of them were things that every human being is true of every human being, almost every human being, except not Jesus, because there are unique attributes that make him special, like,
Mm-hmm.
not being born of a woman, for example. Um, or they're things that just about every political leader would fulfill. Fighting your enemies, bringing laws, that's basically the same thing as being a political leader for the most part. And they're
Exactly.
things that basically every claimed prophet would fulfill as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, they clearly cherry picked those criteria not to fit Muhammad. They picked them
Mm-hmm.
to rule out Jesus. That was their only
To
real goal
disqualify
there.
Jesus. Yep, absolutely. So I've come up with a list of criteria that is very unique to the life of Moses. And then maybe we can compare and see if Muhammad meets a more unique criteria that we should be taking into consideration, right? So clearly it's bad criteria if it's Napoleon and Joseph Smith that it could fit, and probably millions of other political leaders. Something unique to Moses' life was he was a childhood genocide survivor. Something very unique to Moses was that he met God, spoke to God audibly, met him face to face. Moses performed several miracles. Moses is an actual brethren in the bloodline of Israel. He led people, right? Lots of people out of bondage and slavery. He did deliver laws to Israel. He is also in the successions of prophetic blessings promised by Yahweh, which we can pause and talk about that a little bit, Thaddeus. So there's a very specific way in which the blessing is passed from like Abraham through the rest of basically the rest of the prophets here, right? At least in the first 5 books. So how is this passed down? How is the blessing passed? Let's start with Abraham. How did he pass on his blessing?
Explicitly. I'm not quite sure what you're looking for, but
Okay, so Abraham explicitly is told that your blessing, right, will not pass through a particular individual, but it will pass through this other particular individual.
okay.
Can you name those 2 individuals for me?
Yeah. So,
Okay.
of course, it does not go through Ishmael,
Hmm.
interestingly enough, and it does go through Isaac.
Right. So the covenantal blessing goes through one son of the father, of whoever their father is, right? And the same thing happens. So Isaac is blessed by Abraham. And then Jacob, and it's a long story, I'm not going to get into it. Jacob is blessed by Isaac, and so on and so forth, right? So the blessing, the covenantal blessing, is going to be through Jacob, right? So Jacob is really the final one here because all the descendants of Jacob are going to be blessed. He is the one with the 12 sons, right, who are the 12 tribes of Israel. So the actual blessing goes through him. Now Ishmael does receive a blessing, right? But it's not a prophetic blessing. It's not a blessing that the God's covenant is going to be with them or through them. It's just a general blessing because Ishmael is a son of Abraham, right?
Yes,
Understand that,
and
right?
of
Okay.
course, Muslims will refer to that text, and they'll say that Ishmael was blessed, and he was told that he would, father a great nation or whatever.
Hmm.
What they don't tell us is that the text talks about it being fulfilled, that it's fulfilled within his own lifetime. It's not. It is a prophecy to him, but it's not a prophecy to any later generation. It's fulfilled within
Interesting.
his own lifetime.
That seems problematic, but let's ignore that. Okay, Thaddeus, we're just going to keep ignoring facts. Not important for the discussion. Um, so moving on to the next point here, delivered messages in the name of Yahweh, right? And has no failed prophecies. This is the criteria that is very unique to Moses, that is very unique to the passage at hand and in which we are coming up
Uh,
with, right? So
yeah,
at
before
best, yeah, go
real
ahead.
quickly before you go on, is there one of those criteria on your list that the text makes explicit in kind of the farewell message of Moses as to what the people were looking for as a prophet like Moses?
I'm not sure where you're going to go with this, but the first thing that comes to mind is there has never been a prophet to this day that has arisen in Israel like Moses. Is that where you're going with this?
Yeah, yeah. So that passage.
Okay. Right, because a lot of people are going to say, if they don't know that passage, they're going to say, well, Joshua seems to be that person,
Right,
right?
which is the some Jewish people would say that it is unfulfilled and it's about the future Messiah, but the most
Hmm.
common Jewish interpretation is that Joshua fulfilled this.
Right.
But that passage specifically says that hasn't been a prophet to arise like Moses who knew God face to face.
Yes. Okay. I see where you're going with it. Yeah,
I think it also
that's a
mentions
beautiful
the
one.
working the miracles, but I was specifically referring to the face to face, as in this is the most important criteria.
Correct. All right, so we're going to move into that, right? But let's of all that list, right? We can basically Muhammad, none of that, except for one thing we can make a little bit of an argument for. Muhammad led people with hurt feelings away from a town full of bullies. So that's kind of like Moses leading his enslaved nation out of horrible bondage and into the promised land that they were promised for an inheritance for the last 400 some odd years. It's kind of the same. And Pharaoh tried to kill them and do all these kinds of crazy stuff. But if it's just the general idea of somebody bullied me and I had my feelings hurt, so I ran away, is the same thing as escaping abject slavery back to your homeland, then I guess we could say that Muhammad is a little bit like Moses. But that's if that's the best that they can do. I don't really.
Yeah, and
I
I've
don't
never
really know.
heard a Muslim make that argument. It's always, well, it's usually, if you can say it's Jesus, you can say it's Muhammad. That's what they usually
Hmm.
do. And if they try to make something a little more specific, it'll be just like that first list that Muhammad got married, just like 90% of humans and human history. And Jesus didn't. Therefore, it is Muhammad.
Right. No, exactly. Sorry, my earbud fell out there for a second. Yeah, you're right. That's exactly. They try to just it's a tu quoque. It's a false dichotomy. They try to just exclude Jesus, so therefore the only option you
Yeah,
of course
because
have is
this
Muhammad.
argument that you have here, that would be more of like trying to make a Christian type argument,
Hmm.
like actually respecting the text and trying to find unique ways that they're connected. And
Right.
Muslims, their scripture doesn't understand biblical typology, and they certainly don't understand it. So you're making a better argument than they do, is what I'm trying to say.
No, I'm trying my best. I'm trying to be as charitable as possible. Um, sorry, I'm just so yeah, I'm trying to be as charitable as possible to the Muslims. I'm trying to help them out, right? Because if we really are going to have Muslims watch this video and say, you know what, um, Muhammad's just not in Deuteronomy 18:18. He's just not. We need to do our very, very best to address from every possible angle what their argument might be, right? So that's why I'm trying to be charitable. I'm trying to, we kind of joke and sarcastic and a little bit mockery or whatever, but we're trying to address it from every possible angle so that they don't have anywhere else to go except for the easiest thing, which is to say, you know what, you're right. Muhammad is not actually a prophet like Moses, not according to this verse.
Yeah, no tearing down straw men here. We're strengthening their argument rather than
Hmm.
making it as weak as possible.
Yep, we are trying to steel man their position as best as possible. And we also have the stream open for Muslims to come up. If we messed up something or they have another angle in which we have not addressed, we want to hear from you. We want to have a discussion and a dialogue with you. And we will let the chips fall where they may. We'll let the cream rise to the top, so to speak. So I'm gonna give us a list here, Thaddeus. Would you mind reading it for me?
Sure, I can do that.
Actually, let me read the title and then you can
Oh,
read all the descriptions
I
here.
was about to
How
read the
Muhammad is
title.
like
Gosh.
Moses. Yeah. So go ahead and tell me all the ways you see on your screen that Muhammad is like Moses.
Uh, well, unless you forgot to advance the slide, I'm not seeing anything.
Oh. Yeah, no, I wrote it like that on purpose.
I
So
figured you did. I
they're
figured you
they're
did.
literally, guys, we went through this, and Christians, you can help us out. Like maybe we missed something in this slide, but I honestly can't find a single way, meaningful way, that Muhammad is like Moses. I can literally find no meaningful criteria in which I would think that partially he would be like Moses, or fully he would be like Moses, or anything like that. I honestly can't find it.
Yeah, I don't know. Led as spiritually blind people.
Say what?
I said that he was the leader of a spiritually blind people, or maybe better put,
Okay.
a stubborn, rebellious people.
Stubborn and stiff-necked people. Okay, yeah, that might be a good that might be a good criteria. Maybe we'll do a bonus video on that, unless you have an immediate refutation of it, Thaddeus. But that's good. I think that would be a better argument for him. I think, to say, look, he led stubborn and rebellious people. I think that's great. That's a fantastic one. We'll ignore the rest of the criteria that rejects him, but we'll at least we'll hold on to that one and shove all the other ones under the rug.
All right.
Sound like a plan to you?
Yep. So we have that, and we have some very trivial criteria, and now we'll see. So that's the Muhammad side. Now we have to compare that to other arguments, and of course, since we're Christians, we'll look at the Christian argument here and see how much more or less Jesus is like Moses.
Yeah. So Jesus is like Moses, and I can say this because my Bible says this as well. Muhammad can't necessarily say this, right? I know the Quran 7:157, that you can find him described in there. But Jesus says it a lot more eloquently. He says it a lot more specifically. He says, "For if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me." So let's see.
Actually, before you go on,
Yeah.
this is an aside, but it occurred to me when you were saying that. Of course, if you actually read the Quran in context, 7:157 is addressed to Moses. So Moses is being told that he should see the messenger written in his Torah and his Gospel. Very interesting that Moses apparently had access to the Gospel.
Yep. So yeah, there's a couple of different angles you can take this. I've heard a lot of people with those angles. Again, for me, I try to be as charitable as possible. On face value.
Just a little aside there that Moses should be able to recognize Muhammad in the Bible, apparently.
Yeah, but apparently, according to Jesus, Moses recognized Jesus because Moses wrote about him. So let's use the criteria that we talked about earlier, the more meaningful criteria, right? And some of this you can just say whatever, but both Jesus and Moses were child genocide survivors. They both met God face to face, spoke to God face to face on a mountain, by the way. That's kind of a little addition there. They both performed miracles. They are brethren because in their bloodline, they are actual Israelites. Moses led people out of bondage and slavery, and Jesus did this on a much more spiritual and permanent level. They both delivered laws to Israel on a mountain, right? And a lot of Muslims are going to argue with this. Well, Jesus didn't give any new laws. First of all, Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you." And he gives a new commandment. But also, when he was on a mountain, known as the Sermon on the Mount, he gave laws, expanded upon laws, fulfilled laws, right? So he was actually giving laws in those sense, in that sense as well. Jesus is personally in the succession of blessings promised by Yahweh. He is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, where the scepter of rulership shall not depart. He is from the tribe of Judah. He is the Messiah. He is an Israelite, right? So he is personally in the succession of blessings, which came through Jacob, who is Israel, and the 12 tribes of Israel. It has to be that particular way. Jesus, as we mentioned, delivered messages in the name of Yahweh. Jesus has no failed prophecies. He ascended to a mountain with 3 disciples, like Moses did, and they heard the voice of God. And here's a kind of a fun aside a little bit with the child genocide survivor. The Israelites because of a drought, went to Egypt, and they came back with Moses, right? Jesus, when he was taken away, or when he survived the child genocide, he went to Egypt and he returned back to the promised land, just like the Israelites went away from the promised land to Egypt and came back. But anyway you splice it, Jesus fulfills this criteria, and he fulfills it well. Now, Thaddeus, would you like to add anything to this list that I missed?
Well, you kind of alluded to it with the transfiguration. You didn't explicitly use that term, of course, but you talked about him, going up the mountain with three disciples. What you didn't say there, however, is that he radiated the divine glory, which
Yes.
is a crucial comparison in the opinion of the New Testament, that what Moses had that was only temporary, that Moses would radiate the divine glory temporarily after talking with God, that Jesus has permanently by nature. And of course, there's no conception
Yes.
of that at all in Islam.
That's why you're here, Thaddeus. Thank you, sir. No, that's a fantastically perfect point. I alluded to it, but I didn't include that detail. Thank you, sir, for doing so. We're just strengthening the case that the prophet like Moses is, in fact, Jesus. Right? So if the audience wants to participate in this, if anybody wants to call, Thaddeus, I'll give you a chance for your particular conclusions. My conclusion, at least, by researching this, is that Muhammad is not in any way, shape, or form the prophet like Moses. And in fact, he is a false prophet delivering false revelations from a false God. And according to their verse and the surrounding verses in the context that Mohammedans lead us to, Muhammad should have actually been put to death under the Israelite law. However, we just noticed that in a meaningful criteria, Jesus does actually fulfill the prophecy and the criteria of being a prophet like Moses. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that. I'll get into my final conclusion here, and then we can open up for...
Yeah, well, I mean, I basically, of course, have the same conclusion that, well, abundantly obvious that Muhammad doesn't have any real claim to be like Moses. And of course, Jesus has some pretty strong claims.
Word. All right. So moving on to kind of the final thing. And like I said, if you want to share your link, Thaddeus, and any Muslims want to come up and have a discussion, if you have time for it, I've got some time. We can do that.
Yep, I'll go ahead and post the link. Go ahead and share your thoughts.
Yeah, for sure. So the question here is, if you're Muslim, you're watching this, how should you react to this? Right. So you can actually go ahead and affirm. This does not take you out of Islam. You can affirm that Jesus is in fact the prophet like Moses who fulfilled that prophecy, right? Because you also hold what I believe to be a counterfeit Jesus, but let's lay that aside. You also hold that he was a prophet and he fulfilled prophecies and that he is the Messiah. So there's nothing wrong with you just looking at the evidence of Deuteronomy 18:18, looking at the entirety of the biblical text, looking at how it couldn't possibly be about an Arab prophet, and just go, you know what? Jesus does fulfill this. Muhammad does not fulfill this, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Muhammad is a false prophet, right? Because the Surah 7, ayah 157 necessitates that Muhammad is found in our scriptures. But all you need to do is to be able to find him in two locations, one in the Torah and the other one in the Injil or in the Gospel. That's what your specific text says. So if you can find Muhammad twice, once in the Old Testament, I'll even give you the Old Testament, even though it literally says Torah or the law, which is the first 5 books, or in the Gospels. So you've got a lot more chances here. Okay, so let's just cross that one off the list, Muslims. This one's just not for you. We're going to move on. We're going to go through some other ones here in the future. So my best advice is to, as Dory says in Finding Dory or Finding Nemo, I can't remember which one, just keep swimming or just keep searching, right? However, if we get through this entire series and you don't find Muhammad, then that necessitates, if you're going to be intellectually honest, that you reject him as a prophet. You conclude that the Quran is therefore wrong, which means that the Quran is not from an all-knowing God, and that means that Muhammad delivered false revelation, and unfortunately, you've been following a false religion. Okay, but don't think of that as being a bad thing. Think of learning about that as being a good thing, because that sets you free from having false beliefs and then allows you to pursue more true beliefs. So that's what I hope this series does, and that's what I hope you're able to conclude today, that it's not Muhammad, it is Jesus. But you can hold on to a little bit of hope that you can maintain your faith if you can find Muhammad in the scriptures. But then again, that is, if they do find Muhammad in the scriptures, that affirms our scriptures. And our scriptures go directly in contradiction with what the Quran says. And if they're both written from the same God, like the Quran says, then that means that they're contradictory. So it couldn't possibly be from God. I don't know. Whatever, Muslims.
Bit of a
you can
dilemma
figure
there. A bit of a dilemma.
Yeah. Pretty rough stuff. So I think that's it. That's the end of my slideshow. Yay. So I will stop sharing, or you will stop sharing, or somebody will stop sharing. There we go.
All right. So I did post the link. I'm sure that people have heard it by now, even with the delay. We'll give a few minutes. I do have some comments that I gathered from the audience during the show. First, we have a question from Lucent. Do Muslims know the original Hebrew doesn't have chapter numbers and verses to just randomly stop when it's convenient for them? I know it's a bit of a rhetorical question, but I mean, of course, the average Muslim doesn't think about that. Even if maybe if you know it intellectually, they don't think about it. They just. But in fairness to them, it's pretty common in Christianity too. Then those verse numbers are great because they allow us to reference a text easily, but they do also give the false impression that you can just rip something out of context and understand it. And that's a problem that that Christians and Muslims share when they read the Bible.
Good answer, sir.
So in response to your asking the audience what they think of the evidence, Waza 987 says, to me, the story of Moses, Jesus more often parallels God than Moses. He gives the commandment. He feeds the people in the wilderness. He passes ahead of people on the water.
100%. And again, this doesn't have to be one or the other, right? This is and. So when we read about, especially the angel of the Lord, the angel of Yahweh, and all the things that God does for the Israelites, we see that Jesus completely fits the depiction as being God. And Jesus also fits the depiction as being a prophet. Right. And that's why, and that we don't just make up things and then, ad hoc, figure out how to work it out later. Christian theology comes from an honest reading and an exegesis from text. Right. So as Christians, because we read the Bible and we believe it, it clearly demonstrates that Jesus was fully God and fully man. Right. So it's pretty simple. And I'm glad that Waza 987 sees that. Absolutely. I agree with you 100% that when you read the Exodus account, especially, you can see Jesus as being Yahweh. And you can also see Jesus as being like Moses. And when we get to the full revelation of God, which is found in Christ Jesus, we realize that he is fully God and fully man. That's why it makes sense.
Yeah, and of course, Jesus says that the entire Bible is about him, not just Moses. So he is the prophet like Moses, but he's also so much more, that the entire Bible is his story, which kind of only makes sense if he is God.
Right. 100%.
Nagonai Seizi says Muhammad is in the Bible.
Oh, he says is in the Bible. Yeah.
And in other places, but not in Deuteronomy 18:18. This
Okay.
isn't a Muslim, just to be clear. So they're probably
okay.
Vaguely alluding to passages about false prophets.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll see. Maybe there are some passages that pretty accurately describe Muhammad as we go along.
We're giving it the good old college try, y'all. We're gonna give it a good shot, and then we might tip our hat at the end and show where Muhammad might actually be mentioned. But just Muslims never say that he's in that particular spot, but Christians believe that he is. So we'll help you out, Muslims, but we'll wait till the end before we do that. The end of all of these passages.
And then D says, later in Deuteronomy, a prophet has not arisen. Could have gone into more. Anthony Rogers went over how speaking face to face with God is how God says Aaron and Miriam are not like Moses. So maybe we'll open the next stream is on another passage in Deuteronomy that Muslims like to go to. So maybe we'll open that, connecting what we talked about this week with how, with the kind of the conclusion of Moses' story, where it says that this has not been fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
And he has defeated us here. He did find another way that both Muhammad and Moses are similar, and Jesus definitely does not fulfill this criteria. And even even Napoleon and Joseph Smith do not fulfill this criteria, and that's that their names begin with the letter M or with an sound.
Mm-hmm. And do they have the im sound at the end? It is the respect. It is under the respect. Muhammadim. Muhammadim. Yeah, no, that's a checkmate for us. We probably need to go back to the drawing board on this.
Yeah, and just off the top, I'm sure there probably have been other people who would fulfill all those criteria and whose name started with M, but I can't think of one off the top of my head.
How about Mingus Khan? He did lead the Mongolians, which are similar sounding to the Muslims. They both start with M, and maybe they're, I don't know. I'm trying to Mingus Khan.
Maybe we should save this argument for when we look at Song of Solomon, because
let's not.
I think he's enhancing Zakir Naik's case here.
Zakir Naik's he's a pretty formidable opponent.
As long as he never faces an actual debater, he will always be the champion Muslim debater.
Absolutely. Undefeated in his own mind.
He had 2 debates, as near as I can tell, in his entire career with Christians. Some random pastor he found in India, and a guy who had never done a debate before, but was actually involved with talking about Islam. So he gets, I don't know, a quarter of a point. He gets 1/4 of a real debate.
Okay, we'll go with it. But
and he's undefeated cool in that 1/4 of a real debate.
And he says, verse number 18, and it sounds like he's got a good rhythm to his speech, man. I need to start working on something like that.
Clearly he's got something going for him, because he is quite wealthy.
He is, indeed.
So this is proof that Zakir Naik is a true prophet. I mean, a true apologist. that he has
chosen
grown
by the great
quite
God, Allah.
Wealthy, but by basically just memorizing some verses and repeating them very fast. Mm-hmm. He says the same thing every time he talks. I mean, he doesn't come up with any new arguments. And additionally, just about everything he says, he borrowed from D.
Yep.
I won't say stole, because, he had permission.
Right.
But
Yeah. D-Dot was his
D-Dot is
teacher.
the one who actually came up with the arguments, but he wasn't as good as, rattling them off and impressing people.
Right. Although D-Dot was, he had a
And
bunch. I liked his demeanor more. He seemed like he was kind of like a. I mean, he had his moments where he wasn't great, but he seemed like kind of like a jolly guy, And then Zachary Naik is just not a jolly fellow.
yeah, and not only that, D-Dot had real debates. He debated real Christian speakers. So,
Mm-hmm. Yep, and we'll skip over the part where he, ended up probably giving himself a stroke because he challenged God or whatever. But we'll move past that.
well, yeah. But, if we're only judging him against Zachary Naik, he still comes out on top by a large margin, I would say.
I would agree, especially for the innovation status. He was innovative.
And Villainous says, Milliam the Monkerer invaded England in 1066.
Yes, that's exactly what happened, and therefore the prophet.
I'm sure if we think hard enough, we can probably come up with some more super trivial comparisons between Moses and Muhammad. Actually, interestingly, and this one would be actually fairly valid comparison if it wasn't for the fact that it's clearly manufactured. But the later Muslim biographies, not the early ones, but the later ones, make Muhammad's life divided into 3 sets of 20. And this is done intentionally because Moses' life is 3 sets of 40.
That makes sense.
So that would actually be a pretty good one. I've never seen a Muslim bring that one either. So there you go. We got another pretty decent argument that Muslims don't even know because they don't know how to think about Scripture.
We're helping you out, y'all. We're here to help. Give us your zakat.
Yeah, and we promise we won't use it to buy ourselves. I think it was like 37 properties, something like that Nike had bought for himself with zakat money before India cracked down and he had to flee the country.
I did not know the details about that. That is
don't quote me on the number. That's probably not accurate, but so India they got him on 2 things. One was fraud, and that was because he took a bunch of money that was supposedly given to charity, or zakat as Muslims would say it, and used it to buy properties for himself and his family.
That was nice of them. They needed it. That's charitable.
Right. Exactly. And then the other one was inducing terrorism. That one, I don't know. I think that's a little bit of a vague charge. I'm not so sure I agree that he should really be held accountable for his words. Because, there's certainly speakers who are more explicit about encouraging terrorism. But the fraud, that's pretty bad there.
Pretty explicit, yeah.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing anyone coming up. It looked like we probably had a lot of problems with the stream. So for those who stayed with it, good on you. I'm sure you probably had some buffering problems along the way. So I really appreciate you sticking with it. The recording will probably be fine, but the actual live stream, it looks like there was some buffering going on. And I'm not pushing out very much. My internet should easily handle it. I must just be having a very bad connection tonight.
Yeah, I don't know, but hopefully at least you could hear our words okay, and the slides were clear enough for you guys. But like I said, man, or like you said, we appreciate you, audience, kind of sticking through it. And I know we had to kind of push back and had some technical difficulties a little bit earlier on, but hopefully in the replay and the editing and stuff like that process, we'll be able to get this thing whittled down to something pretty easy to comprehend and pretty easy to understand.
All right.
We forgot to say Bismillah, actually.
Yeah, see, that's the problem.
That's what it was.
If we'd just done that, then the stream would have been fine.
We'll try it next time. We'll see how that goes. Trying to see any other comments or anything like that. Are we ready to shut her down?
Nope. I think we'll call it quits for the night here. Oh well, actually, before we go, why don't you give a preview of next time, at least the passage that we're going to be talking about.
Oh yeah. I forgot to give you a little preview like I did last week. So we're going to go to Deuteronomy 32. We're going to talk about 10,000 something fighting and something like that. At the end of the day, we're going to talk about how Muslims inadvertently deify Muhammad, which is shirk.
Which,
So
interestingly, is a very common problem in these passages that go to. You know, I hate to ruin the rest of the series, but I think 1818 is probably actually the best they have, because it's really pretty much the only one that's legitimately about a prophet. I suppose Isaiah 42 is legitimately partially about a prophet, even though that prophet is explicitly said to be Yahweh. But we find that they go to these passages which either have zero to do with a prophet, or do they go to these passages that are explicitly about God's actions and pretend that they're about Muhammad? Or in at least one case, they go to, no, I think at least two cases, they go to passages that are condemning people and they say they're about Muhammad.
Yeah. And actually, I do want to make a correction. I double-checked myself. It's not Deuteronomy 32, and I may have actually wrote that wrong on my first slide. It's Deuteronomy 33, in which they think that it's Muhammad who dawns forth from Sinai. That's all I'm going to say. Muhammad dawns forth from Sinai, showing forth from Paran. And we all know that Mount Paran is in Mecca, and so clearly anything that says Paran in it and seer is absolutely, without doubt, always about Muhammad and the Arabs. There's no possible way it could be about anything else. There's no possible way it could be talking about Yahweh himself. That would be blasphemous and shirk. So yeah, that's some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in next week's episode.
Yeah, and maybe we had Saffraz here before we started. I don't know, 5-10 minutes before we started, saying we were clowns, and then he disappeared. Maybe one of these streams he'll have the guts to come up and defend the passage. When I first met him, he claimed this was his specialty. Muhammad in the Bible was his specialty.
Oh, really? Okay.
However, he has not shown up 2 times in a row now. But, maybe he'll show up next time. So, Saffraz, Deuteronomy 33, be ready. We want to hear your arguments.
Man. Well, and then even in the comment section, Saffraz, if you want to drop a line and tell us how terrible we did, and any other Muslims, I'd personally check, and I know Thaddeus is pretty active in his own comment section. If you do have an argument, or Christians, if you'd like to add anything to what it was we said, we'd be more than happy to engage with you. And as a matter of fact, a Christian had in the comment section from our last video showed us something pretty interesting that we are actually now going to include in one of the future videos. So we're all learning together. We're all seeking truth together. None of us are so knowledgeable that we can't learn anything or that we can't make mistakes here and there. But hopefully what we can be is humble enough and willing enough to learn and admit our mistakes, and have enough integrity to work, to grow, to continue to get better and better.
Yep, yeah, absolutely. We welcome feedback. Because our pursuit here is the truth, and we want to make the best arguments. We want to take these arguments seriously because we want Muslims to hear the arguments. It's really easy to say Muhammad couldn't be the prophet like Moses because he revealed the satanic verses. I would say it's 100% valid. It's crystal clear from any reasonable standpoint that if anything is true about the historical Muhammad, that would be right up there at the top of the list. But the Muslim will just dismiss that. So, that's a perfectly valid argument. Any non-Muslim would probably say, yep, that definitely rules him out. Now, I'm not just saying a Christian here. A atheist likewise would say clearly he doesn't fulfill the criteria. I don't believe either of these things actually happened, but if they're true, he doesn't fulfill the criteria.
Right.
But the Muslim will just dismiss it. So we want to take their arguments as seriously as possible. I think we granted, like, I don't know, 6 different assumptions to keep moving along and look at it from another angle. So maybe maybe that's a good closing thought to the Muslim is, if you have to keep making assumptions, if you have to keep granting things and making the passage so vague that nearly anyone could fulfill it except Jesus, well, then it's probably not a valid way to read the text. And more importantly, it's probably not a valid way to conclude that Muhammad is a prophet. So there's a clip that I recently put up of Shabir Ali saying basically, yes, Muhammad is in the Bible, as long as you go to passages that are really vague, that someone somewhere has at some time claimed might be about Jesus. The Christians claimed it's about Jesus, therefore we can claim it's about Muhammad, therefore Muhammad's a prophet. I don't think that's probably how to do things. Just a thought.
I'm pretty sure that Shabir Ali saying I am an atheist and I don't believe anything without saying it. You know what I mean? How do you say you don't believe in God at all without saying it? That is exactly how you do it.
Of course, he didn't use those words, but that was the only way you could get anything out of what he said.
That was the gist.
Yeah, he was trying to say that this is legitimate by Muslims, but what he's really saying is, yeah, there's nothing there.
Poor guy. Well,
alrighty. So thank you all for joining us. I got a couple streams coming up this week, so look for announcements on those. We'll have Ask Truth back on again soon for the next episode of Finding NoMo. Thank you all for joining us. God bless.
see you guys. God bless you.